Welcome to another episode of Southern Home Talk. I'm Chuck Phillip with South Alabama Home Inspections, and we're continuing the series of Hurricane Ready. This short series is going to be on evacuating. This is part 5, episode 44. The one thing about hurricanes is time's really never on our side. So if you live in a low-lying area, it should be a no-brainer that you should evacuate. And you may not have to evacuate far away, but I would certainly want to get to a location further inland so I wouldn't have to worry about storm surge coming in and sweeping me away. Now, if they issue a mandatory evacuation order, you're going to want to be the first one there again to leave, because these roads have really never kept up with the infrastructure. And not only that, there's already a lot of crowded roads here during the summertime. So the thing of it is, if you're not the first one, then there's a possibility you can be on the highway caught in the storm. Usually a lot of the feeder bands start coming in first, and so the roads are already going to be wet sometimes during the evacuation process. And so you got this many cars out on the highway and already rainy weather, and so it's just a matter of time before something probably happens on the highway. So it's just all it takes is just a minor collision, or people not familiar with the area, not knowing where to go, people driving slow. It just doesn't take a whole lot to slow down these highways. And so, really, if you're going to evacuate, that's something that has to be really planned out, because you may wind up being stuck in traffic for hours on end. Some evacuation routes may be flooded well ahead of the storm due to just the initial storm surge prior to its arrival. This could probably happen as much as 12 hours before the storm's even scheduled to make landfall. So just be aware that some roads may already be closed, and as a result, this could add more traffic on the roads that are still open and still available to use. And with the population down here being far more than what it used to be, and our infrastructure not really keeping up with it, this can really create a lot of problems out there on the highway as far as evacuating. Well, probably the best advice I can give is my own story of evacuating. Back in 2004, I evacuated for Hurricane Ivan, and I left and headed towards San Antonio. That's where I was going to stay with my mother out there. And I'm glad I had the forethought to fill up 2 5-gallon cans of fuel and put them in my truck before I left. Because if I had not done that, then I would have been camped out on the highway along with hundreds, maybe even thousands of other people that were in the same predicament that everybody else was in. They were unable to get gas because all the gas stations had run out. So this is a real probability. And it was a possibility I could have been camped out in a rest area, or even in the middle of I-10 somewhere in the storm, because I would have no way to get any further than where I was. But as luck would have it, I got down to about a quarter of a tank and put them 2 cans of gas in, and I was able to make it to Orange, Texas. That was the only place that had fuel between Mobile and San Antonio. And I was just barely made it to Orange, Texas. I think I had a little bit less than a quarter of a tank when I pulled in that gas station. Needless to say, I went ahead and filled the 2 5-gallon cans back up too. But it also took almost 24 hours to get there, which would have normally been a 10-hour trip. So I may speak a little bit more about that in another slide. If you live in a low-lying area, or if you're down visiting the Gulf or the beaches, you may want to evacuate to maybe some relatives or friends who live inland, so that way you're just not down in an area that can be taken over by storm surge. And so, and some of these hotels are actually hurricane ready. I mean, you can maybe make a reservation in some of these hotels that are further inland and stay in one of them. That would be a lot safer than staying down at the beach or in a low-lying area. So there's all these other options, but these are things that you should plan ahead for. You should have potential relatives and friends staked out, or even talked to them before, if any storms even get on the radar screen, and say, look, if I have to evacuate, do you mind if I come and stay with you? And if it's a hotel that you're going to go to, I would certainly have a list of those already and already have them on my phone, so I can start calling them to make reservations there so they don't fill up. Well, here's another evacuation issue here. So let's look at Hurricane Frederick back in 1979. You can see in the left photograph here the track this thing took. So if you were going up I-65 and you evacuated the coast and you got caught in a traffic jam, well, this storm's going to be riding straight over you. And it may even be worse in this area than it was down here at the lower level, because many times these hurricanes start spinning off tornadoes the further they get inland. So it's a real hazard just being out there on the highway evacuating. Looking at the right photograph, you can see how big these hurricanes are. They take up pretty much 2 states. I mean, they're pretty wide. And so it's a pretty wide track of destruction that's coming through. And I'll explain more about that in another slide. Okay, here's an example of Hurricane Ivan's track. This is going to be right here at the bottom and going all the way up. And I live right here in Baldwin County, and my mother, she lived in San Antonio, which is way over here. But this is normally around a 10 or 12-hour trip. So I left, I think it was around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And it was really good sailing all the way through Mississippi, the first part of Louisiana. But what happened was they issued a mandatory evacuation of New Orleans. And before I could get past that entrance to I-10, all these people were flooding onto it. So this is where the whole trip came to an end. And it took me about 8 hours to get from right here to about Orange, Texas. And I almost ran out of fuel because there was quite a few people that run out too, and they were camped out in rest areas and in the median of I-10. And like I said earlier, if I hadn't had those 2 5-gallon cans of fuel, I wouldn't have made it. I've been one of them camping out with them. So, it took 23 hours to get from Spanish Fort to San Antonio. And so as a result of that, I'm now more storm prepared than ever, because in my opinion, it's just safer to stay than it is to evacuate. I remember when I evacuated for Hurricane Ivan, I took my dog with me, and there wasn't any hotel that I was aware of that had a pet-friendly policy at that time. That's since changed. I think more hotels now allow pets, but that would be something you would have to take in consideration. And you would also need to consider taking supplies with you in your trip, because you can be in your car in these traffic jams from anywhere from 8, 10, 12, 24 hours. It was 23 hours in my case. And so it's just a real possibility. You have to really pack your car for survival just doing an evacuation. Regardless of storm preparation and evacuation procedures, it's really a good thing to know how to turn off the services to your house. And this is something you should know prior to any type of evacuation. I don't know, I guess it's kind of subjective about cutting off the water to the house if you're evacuating, but it might not be a bad idea to do, especially since a lot of these newer houses have a good bit of the plumbing running inside the attic. But it's really important that you keep your water meter box clean. It's not hard at all for this valve to get covered up with dirt. And another thing too, it's also a good thing to have a secondary cutoff inside the house for this reason. Let's say that it was just raining outside and the pipe busted in the attic. Often these boxes fill up full of water and mud, so now you got to dig it out to try to find it. It's always best to have 2 cutoffs, one on the outside of here at the meter and the other at the house. But at the minimum, know how to cut the water off here at the meter. And you're going to need one of these water meter keys. You could probably do it with a large pair of channel locks or a crescent wrench, but really the thing to use is one of these water meter keys. And you can pick these up at the hardware store, uh, Ace Hardware, Home Depot, Lowe's. These places should have these water meter keys. Well, like I've said, it's always a good idea to have a set of basic hand tools. In this left picture is a very large crescent wrench and a large pair of channel locks, and these can come in handy if you don't have a water meter key, and you're probably going to need this large crescent wrench or this other here to cut off the gas at the house. The valve's right down here at the bottom. Also go see episode 28. I've got a video on how to cut the gas off. And it probably would be a good idea to cut the gas off to the house if you're evacuating. I'm kind of surprised, when I do some of these home inspections, sometimes I talk with the homeowners and they don't know where their panel boxes are. It's just amazing. And also kind of think, well, you've really been kind of lucky too, because you haven't had any problems as far as your power. But this is really a critical thing that everybody needs to know. There's emergencies that arise where you may have to go cut the power off. And sometimes I find these panel boxes blocked by vegetation. I've seen bushes covering these panels on the outside, and maybe in the garage they got shelves and all kinds of contents in front of the sub panel to where you can't get to it. So don't always leave your panel boxes clear. They shouldn't be blocked, and it's also against code to do so. But if you have a newer house, more than likely you're going to have two panels, and you're going to have one on the outside like this one here, and you're going to have a sub panel on the inside. And if you decide to evacuate, you're probably going to want to cut off the power to the house, and the way to do that is to come out to the outside box and not the one on the inside if you do have a sub panel. And hopefully your panel is clearly marked like this one on the right, and you're going to need to cut all these breakers off. And what you see on the right is the main, and if you trip this breaker off, that's going to cut the power to the sub panel that's in your garage or probably your laundry room. That's usually where they are inside the house. But you're also going to cut off these other ones too, because these are independent breakers that control like the dryer, your grinder pump. You've got one of them, one for the air conditioner, one for the heater, and so on and so forth. The main thing is you just want to cut all these breakers off on this outside panel. This is what you're looking at here, is this box on the other side. So, know how to cut off the power to the house. And also, get to know your neighbor. I mean, if you evacuate and you're going to Texas or wherever, it may be several days, maybe a week before you get back. It's probably not a good thing to have your house without power that long, primarily for your air conditioning unit. It doesn't take but around 24 to 48 hours for mold to start forming in your house. And so maybe you can get your neighbor to come back on and just turn on the AC so you can get the house dehumidified before you get back. One of the biggest problems about evacuating itself is the unknown of the trip itself. And so therefore, I recommend that you dress very ruggedly, that you put on some heavy duty clothing, boots if you have them, because this could very well turn into a survival situation out there on the highway. You could very well be caught up in the storm. And so, don't go in your flip-flops and your shorts, because it's going to be harder to change into the more rugged clothing out there on the highway than it would be if you set forth with them already on. So you need to dress as if you're going to go to an episode of Survivor. Well, like I experienced in my evacuation process of not being able to get gas anywhere, that can still happen again. So really, anytime a storm gets out there in the Gulf, or even one makes a threat come in this direction, I always try to keep my tanks capped off. But if you're making an evacuation, you may be out on the highway for 8, 10, 12 hours, like I said earlier, and could run out of fuel. So, and not be able to get gas anywhere because the gas stations are out. I don't really recommend doing this, because really gasoline is a very hazardous substance and it's even explosive. But I think that if I was in a forced situation to where I had to evacuate, I would want to have a couple of gas cans of gas in my car. So hope if you do that, make sure that you have a very tight sealing gas can, because a lot of these trunks are weather tight, and so all it takes is fumes to build within that. You could have an explosive situation. It's just really a catch-22 right here. I mean, what do you do? Do you risk being out on the highway with no gas, or do you risk, a flammable situation in your car by having gas cans in it? It's really a hard call, but I guess that's going to be have to call you're going to have to make yourself. Well, hopefully you already have your storm shutters up, and that'll be one less thing you'll have to deal with as far as the last minute evacuation. I think if I hadn't had them up by now and it came time to evacuate, I would probably just leave them off, because it can take quite a bit of time to hang these. And like I say, you want to be the first one to evacuate, not the last. I would certainly want to take some provisions. I would not want to be in an uncertain situation to where I could be theoretically caught out in the middle of nowhere with no food or water. So definitely bring enough food and water as if you were going to go on a camping trip, because there's a possibility you may need it. Based on the experience I had when I evacuated for Hurricane Ivan, it's easy to see how something like this can go wrong during any evacuation. And so really, if you plan to evacuate, this is something that should be very well thought out ahead of time. And you also need to prepare, for being caught out in traffic and possibly even stranded in the storm itself. So hopefully some of these things I brought out based on my past experience will help you too. Just be safe and plan ahead. Thanks for taking the time to watch this presentation. And if you've been issued an evacuation order, please go ahead and make arrangements to leave as soon as you can. And also please subscribe to Southern Home Talk. We are committed to addressing the issues that affect our southern homes. And also check out the other videos we have on hurricane preparedness. They're actually pretty good, and they're usually include more than just the run-of-the-mill things that you would normally see in a standard to-do list. Thanks again.